The U.S. is taking tough new action against the regime of Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela will now be facing many of the same restrictions the U.S. has historically imposed on Cuba and North Korea. All assets of the Venezuelan government in the U.S. will now be frozen, and transactions with people who have their assets frozen will be banned. Today, representatives of over 50 countries, including Canada, are meeting in Peru to discuss the crisis. So what impact will these sanctions have? And should Canada follow suit? Ben Rosewell is a former Canadian ambassador to Venezuela. He is now president of the Canadian International Council. He joins us from Toronto. Thank you very much for your time today, sir.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. I
want to jump right in and ask you, the U.S. announced these sweeping new sanctions. What impact could that have on the crisis?
Well, I think this actually is a step away from the restoration of democracy in Venezuela and not towards it, because it's going to divide the international community at a time when we desperately need, and Venezuelans desperately need, the international community to be united, to come together and to put an end to the devastating humanitarian crisis in that country.
So Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland said today that Canada is looking at what the Americans did. It's going to be my guess that you would say Canada should not follow suit. Is that your advice?
I don't think we should follow suit. Up until now, Canada's been admirably focused on empowering individual Venezuelan citizens. We've been supporting the return of the Constitution because that means that Venezuelans will be able to elect their own government, though they're calling the shots and not outsiders. We have recognized Juan Guaido as the president because that's what the elected representatives of Venezuelans, that's who they have put their trust in. And likewise, we have been focusing on providing humanitarian assistance to help restore the quality of life of individual Venezuelan citizens. When you introduce a blockade that completely cuts off the economy of Venezuela from the outside world, that does hurt the Maduro regime, but it also hurts individual Venezuelan citizens. And I also think it might reinforce the solidarity of people around Maduro at a time when his regime is quite divided, and a more sophisticated strategy would be to try and reinforce those divisions by offering some olive branches to those that might turn away from President Maduro.
What do you think the American motivation is then to jump in there with these new sanctions? We know that the Americans also want to see the EU embrace some sanctions. Once we spoke with the U.S. representative last week. We'll get to that in a moment. But what do you think the motivations here are from the Americans to move forward with this step if you don't think it's going to help the actual people of Venezuela?
Well, they want to exert maximum pressure. They do want to change the government in Venezuela, which is different. It's a subtle difference, but when you think about it, what we're trying to do in Canada is to empower the people of Venezuela to choose their own government, regardless of what that choice is going to be. The United States, I think, has gone one step further and said they're going to change the government, almost regardless of what the people of Venezuela say. As it turns out, Maduro is deeply unpopular in Venezuela, and so I think there are probably many Venezuelans cheering on the United States. But it's important when we're promoting democracy overseas to always put the emphasis on the will of the individual citizens of that country. They're the ones who should be driving change and not outsiders. And that's what you accomplish by restoring a constitution, as Canada has called for, by having elections. But when you impose a solution from the outside, whether it's through military force, thank God the United States doesn't seem to be going down that direction right now, or a blockade, which is in some senses an act of war, that actually sets Venezuelan citizens back from the situation they need to be in, which is where they're the ones calling the shots.
Okay, on that point, last week here on Power and Politics, we interviewed Elliot Abrams, who is the Trump special advisor on Venezuela. Given his past history in Latin America, his involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, which he later admitted to withholding information to Congress and was found guilty and then had to be later pardoned by George H.W. Bush, given his involvement in what happened in El Salvador, are you concerned about his involvement on the Trump team in this?
I wouldn't comment on any one official of the Trump administration. I do think that the president himself shows more interest in asserting American dominance than in supporting human rights and democracies overseas. And if officials that report to him show similar inclinations, that isn't terribly surprising. The United States does, I think, have a tradition under previous administrations of being a real champion of human rights and democracy. Not always, but there has been a tradition in the history of American foreign policy fighting for those principles, and that seems to be absent in the Trump administration.
As we mentioned while we were introducing you, there's this big meeting taking place in Peru today. What do you expect to come out of that gathering?
Well, unfortunately, this was the venue. This meeting in Lima was the venue of the unfortunate announcement by the United States of this new blockade. As I say, I think this is going to divide the international community, just as the Lima Group was, I think, making some real strides in expanding the consensus beyond the neighbors of Venezuela, which is what the Lima Group essentially is, to some holdout countries that have been supporting Maduro in spite of his widespread rejection by the people of Venezuela. I think this is a setback to that effort because it will polarize the international community between those that will comply with the U.S. measures and those that will resent it and try to block it.
The last thing I just want to ask you about really quickly, the Trump administration sent down a number of heavy hitters on this issue, whether it's they've got Abrams down there, John Bolton's down there, and I believe Wilbur Ross. These are key members of the Trump administration that Donald Trump clearly trusts. Canada has played a leading role at the Lima Group and has been really trying to organize, whether it's support for Venezuelans or support for whatever change that is going to happen in Venezuela. Do you think the Americans, by sending these heavy hitters down there to make this big announcement, to make the big waves, the American government is very powerful, very strong, and very influential, but is this a sign that the Americans are trying to sort of take over the efforts and trying to intervene here?
Well, the United States actually is not a member of the Lima Group. Canada is, but the United States has been an observer to that group. So to send cabinet secretaries and to choose the Lima Group as the venue for making this quite unfortunate announcement, I think does distract from where the leadership has been up until now and should remain, which is with the Venezuelan people. They have elected representatives led by Juan Guaido that have been determining what the political strategy for restoring the country to democracy is. I think Canada has been pretty good at shining the light on the fact that it's Venezuelans that are leading this effort, but the United States not so much.
Ben Rosewell, thank you very much for your time today.
Anytime.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.